Hello and welcome to this edition of Taking the Pulse of Chinese Economy. I'm Guanxin in Beijing. Aging population has become the dominant demographic trend of the 21st century globally. What policy reforms are needed to offset the negative impact on the economy, and what role can innovation play to address the demographic challenges? To explore these issues, joining me today are two distinguished guests. James Liang, Research Professor of Applied Economics at Peking University. Welcome to the show. And Uri Dadush, excuse me?
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
And Manoj Pradhan, founder of Talking Head Macro, an independent macroeconomic research institute. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. So, Professor Liang.
Thanks very much.
I want to start with you, Professor Liang, because you didn't start as a scholar in demographic economics. To many people, you may still be better known as a founder of Trip.com, China's biggest online travel booking site. So what have you observed about Chinese economy? What motivates you to study the demographic changes in China?
Well, I started by looking at the innovation capability of Chinese economy about 15 years ago. Then I noticed that there's a general relationship between aging and innovation capability. You know, countries that were aging, having diminished entrepreneurship and innovation. For example, Japan during the 90s. And then I noticed that China is having a rapidly declining fertility rate. That was like 10 years ago. And I actually predicted that China will have one of the lowest fertility rate in the world. And that turned out to be a very accurate prediction. And recently, as we noticed that China has reported the fertility rate is only a little over 1.1.
That's very alarming
one
level.
Of the lowest in the world. So China is having a very alarming, demographic crisis. So that's been the most important factor that will affect Chinese economy going into the future, long term. So that's why I think, as an economist, I'm looking at from this unique perspective of innovation. That's a very important policy issue. So that's why I've been focusing on this policy issue for the last 10 years.
So you think it's the most? Yeah. So you think the most important issue for long-term economic growth?
Yeah, for long-term Chinese economic growth, it's the most. I think a threat or a potential negative factor affecting Chinese economy in the long run.
Well, globally, between 1970 and 2020, the fertility rate declined in every country in the world. Among the geographic regions, Africa and Europe are currently homes to the highest and the lowest fertility rates at 4.3 and 1.6, respectively. So, Dr. Pradhan, what are the social and economic implications of this fertility decline and fertility gap among different regions, in your opinion?
I think we're seeing one of them right now. Over the last 30 or 35 years, what has happened is we've had a massive demographic tailwind in the advanced economies because of their baby boom.
Right.
And perhaps the most important development in the last century has been the integration of the Chinese labor force into the global economic system. So effectively, what changed was you added a massive labor force into an existing pool of already expanding workers. The effect of that was to create a supply shock to labor unlike anything that we have seen before in history. Perhaps the only one that you can compare this to in the reverse order is the Black Death, in which 25% of the world's labor force was unfortunately killed. And that led to a massive surge in wages. What China's integration did was the opposite. It created a global equilibrium for wages, which led to inflation falling on a very regular basis. It led to wage growth in the advanced economy slowing down. And it created a system where we had consistent growth without really any inflationary problems over the last 30 or 35 years. And that has led to two things. Number one, it has created complacency among policymakers that whatever has happened in the past will remain the same in the future. It's something that we tend to extrapolate as human beings. And the second issue is that it has left us unprepared for a pretty rapid acceleration. I mean, when we think of demography, we think of something happening in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But what's changing today is that a trend that was pulling inflation down for the last 3 decades has suddenly stopped pulling it down. It's not necessarily pushing it up right away, but it has created all sorts of social instability around it at a time when we wanted inequality to be resolved in almost every part of the world, including China and in the advanced economies. This sudden surge of inflation is hitting people who can afford it least. It's a poor man's inflation, and that's what's making matters socially, politically, and economically incredibly difficult.
Indeed. Well, it is ringing an alarming bell and deserves our attention. Actually, many countries have introduced policies to increase fertility rate. Between 1986 and 2015, the number of governments intending to raise their country's birth rates jumped from 19 to 55. Professor Liang, what's your view on the effectiveness of China's recent third-child policy? Because there seems to be a prevailing view that it is not enough to change the low fertility rate in China.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the third-child policy is really not to subsidizing the third-child policy. It's really, officially it's still just allowing to have a third child.
Yes.
Of course, China has scrapped all the fines for, fourth child or fifth child. You can have any number of children today. But China has yet to come up with a pro-fertility policy or yet to have allocate substantial financial resource to help family to raising children yet. So I think in the near future, China will have to, because the current fertility rate of 1.1 is clearly not sustainable, will have to substantially increase its allocation of financial budget to subsidize families with more children.
What supplementary measures, in your opinion, may be needed to encourage this fertility increase?
The most direct way is to issue cash or tax rebates as a subsidy to family with 2 or 3 more children. I think one thing unique that China may be able to do is to subsidize housing. As you know, China's housing price in major cities are very expensive compared to relative to income, and the government has, in the past, has paid a lot of money from, selling the land, residential land, in those cities. So China can allocate some of the money from the land sales to subsidize families with more children. That certainly can help quite a bit to help families, especially in those cities, to raise a bigger family.
How much do you think that China can allocate resources to increase this fertility rate? Do you think the government is doing enough? And how much more can the government afford? Because there are so many things the government should take care of, because there is still poverty issue and urban planning and a lot of things on the plate.
Well, actually, I think China is one of the most capable countries in terms of the ability to raise additional money or to allocate additional money to help families. Because China, the saving rate in China is extraordinarily high. It's like 40%. It's like 20% higher than any other country, or the average countries, average developed countries. And currently, China is spending those savings on, roads, public infrastructure. But China in the future will not need many more roads, because China is already having the longest freeway, the highest, the longest high-speed railway. And China will need to find ways to spend those savings. And the good way to spend those savings is to spend on families with children. So as long as Chinese government can allocate shift those savings and investments from hardware, from infrastructure to human resource investment, I think China can definitely afford it.
Now, Professor Liang, you just touched about a very important issue is a shifting demand along with the demographic changes. You're talking about the less demand for infrastructure, high-speed roads, but there may be increasing demand for healthcare, pension, and childcare. What changes do you think in the demand pattern in China? Professor Liang? Professor Liang, can you hear me?
Let me elaborate that a little bit. China is currently spending 5 to 10% on just the roads, but on average, developed country usually spend 1 to 3% on family support. So that's why I say the number, you say 1 to 3% is a lot of money, but right. China spends 5 to 10% more than any other country on public infrastructure. So yeah, China can definitely allocate some of the money to human resource. And on public health, did you ask, sorry, can you repeat the question? Did you ask about public health?
I mean, there may be a changing pattern of demand as the population and ages. You know, there is a growing demand for childcare, healthcare. How should the government adapt to the changing demand?
The changing demand healthcare, yeah, I think the overall trend is that as China is aging, there will be more and more with demand from the elderly to spend on healthcare. Currently, China is still relatively young because there's a the fertility and the aging takes 10, 20 years to a lag to take effect. But in the next 10, 20 years, China will enter into a stage in a rapid aging. There will be more demand for healthcare, especially for the elderly. So China, as I said, needs to allocate more resources. China currently is spending a lot of saving on infrastructure, but in the future there's not a strong need for infrastructure anymore. But China needs to shift more resources to spend more money on family and as well as on the elderly for healthcare. So that's going to be the pattern you will see in the future, to shifting resources from infrastructure to healthcare and to family support, hopefully.
Indeed, I think a lot of economists would agree that demand side, we should put more attention on the demand side to increase domestic demand of Chinese economy to be more balanced. And Dr. Pradhan, how effective are policy responses to low fertility rate around the world, or in India in particular? What are some of the best practices, in your opinion?
Well, they're not very effective. It turns out that the rate at which you can change the ability of families to get along with a fewer number of children when their incomes are better, when social programs are improving, I think it tends to go down much faster. In the UK, for example, what we've seen is that any change to the population, any benign change to the population, has mostly been the result of immigration, and which is why obviously the debate around Brexit has been so important for the future of the economy, not just for the politics. Broadly speaking, where programs have encouraged more childbearing, the clash has been between the incentives that the government gives and whether families actually want to have a larger foundation themselves. I think most families have been reluctant to go beyond 1 or 2 kids, only given the modern costs of looking after children. And I'm not really sure monetary compensation has helped a lot. Yes, there are families on the margin that do respond. It's not that everyone is immune. But what you need from a macroeconomic standpoint, a surge in having a third child, I think is difficult to achieve. Let's say they're incredibly successful. I think what changes is that we will have educated workers joining the workforce 15 to 20 years from now. So even though demographic changes are happening only very slowly, the timing of the change in that story, I think, is happening far more rapidly. I think policies are effective, and if they're effective, to what extent they're effective, and if they turn out to have some considerable impact on the economy, which I'm skeptical about, I think the timing of when they will join that labor force still means that we've got a fair amount of work to do before we start thinking that the policy has been a success.
Meanwhile, economic crisis, pandemic, and war tend to have big impact on demographic development. Professor Liang, has the pandemic played a role in changing people's mindset about having more children?
I think overall, looking at the data globally, has a mild negative effect on childbirth. Maybe 5 to 10%, looking at data globally. So the decline of fertility rate recently in China is partly due to that, but not much, because the last 2 years the decline has been 30%. So the most of it is actually the general declining trend of the Chinese fertility rate. A small part is due to the negative effect of the pandemic, people facing uncertainty and etc. Yeah.
And Dr. Pradhan, have you seen any impact of the pandemic or the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict on demographics around the world?
I think there is an open question about how it changes demographics over the last 5 years. I mean, if you look at excess deaths that have been recorded in the advanced economies, I think it's entirely fair to say that the bulk of those deaths have been among the elderly in the population, the most vulnerable, especially in the early stages. And though, at least in the advanced economies, the infection rates are pretty high again, I think the fatalities this time around have been relatively low. But I think what that implies is for some of those are, if you will, deaths that would have happened over a period of the next 5 years, perhaps some of the 10 years. So unfortunately, some lives have been cut short, which would have carried on for a little while longer. But the overall demographic trend, I think, that we need to worry about is twofold. Number one, not only is the labor force becoming smaller. As you know, economic growth is a function of two things. It's a function of the growth rate of labor supply and the change in productivity. I think what Professor Liang's bringing to the table is that the two might be joined at the hip. What we generally want is for something like the Chinese economy to replace the amount of labor that they're losing with a technological advantage that will allow you to produce the same or a higher level of output. That's what we want. That becomes a little bit harder to do if you think the population is not going to be as innovative, or if you move away from manufacturing to a services sector. In the manufacturing sector, it's much easier to implant technology to replace workers or to increase their productivity. In the services sector, it's much harder. And the second thing we need to look at is that the needs of a really aging population are very different from a modestly old population. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about what dementia and neurodegenerative diseases bring to the table. Not very good things, unfortunately. If you're between 50 and 60, you're very unlucky to have dementia or some other form of neurodegenerative diseases. That number increases by about 2.3 times between 60 and 75. Between 75 and 85, it increases 4.5 times. And after 85, the chances of most people suffering from some form of neurodegenerative disease is nearly 100%, which means the health care that they need is different from what you and I think healthcare is. The kind of attention that they need, we haven't even started thinking of yet as a society, and that needs to change very quickly.
Indeed, we need to be prepared for these changes. And let's talk a little bit more about the aging population and economy. Demography is destined is often a often cited phrase that suggests the size, growth, and structure of a nation's population determines its long-term social, economic, and political fabric. For example, some experts say Africa will be the place of fast growth and talent in a few decades, since that is the only region where population keeps growing. Professor Liang, Do you agree to that? Could you help us understand the correlation between population and economic growth?
Yeah. I think we already talked about labor supply being a very important factor globally. The Chinese economy did add a huge supply of cheap labor in the past, decade or 2 decades. But going forward, the biggest impact, from my perspective, I think that's a pretty unique perspective, is how much talents, how many R&D workers or researchers adding to the pool for innovators. So as you know, Chinese is entering a period or a stage of advanced economy. It's competing head-on on the technology race with U.S. and other developed countries. And Chinese economy is adding massively, millions or tens of millions of new researchers to the innovation economy. And that will change the landscape of economic competition for the advanced economy profoundly in the next few years or next decades or two to come. And the immediate effect, of course, Chinese is getting to the frontier of the innovation. And I think, first of all, it's not a zero-sum game, right? Innovation can benefit the whole world. That's a good thing. But strategically, China is competing with the U.S. head-on-head, very close race to watch the competition between U.S. and China. But the demographic factor is one thing that people probably didn't take full attention of, is that Chinese, the innovation capability of Chinese companies and universities will hurt by the declining of younger populations, because the recent steep decline of fertility rate will make the pool of the Chinese researchers or talents much smaller than people have anticipated. You're talking about 1.1 fertility rate is you're talking about shrinking the talent pool by half in just one generation. So that will have huge impact on the relative the strength of the pool, the size of the human resource between U.S. and China. So that's a big factor to think about.
Indeed, and that is a very urgent issue about shrinking demographic dividend for a Chinese economy. And Dr. Pradhan, you've been talking about the increasing burden on the society. Actually, in Europe, the working age population will fall more than 20% between 2015 and 2055. So what can be done by the government to cope with the challenges, especially considering that these governments actually have very high level of debt?
I think debt's an issue pretty much everywhere you look at. Over the last 30 years, falling interest rates have made us believe that we can service this level of debt indefinitely into the future. And there's some solution will have to be played out where central banks, with their massive balance sheets, actually become financiers of the government, paying one eye on, or putting one eye on where the debt burdens are and another eye on where the inflation story is. The two are obviously connected at the hip. If you look at Europe, I think, yes, their stories are profoundly similar to everything that I've heard about the Chinese economy and what we've continued to research as well. The problems over there are slightly different in the sense that the ability to push through either reforms or to push through policies is a little bit more difficult. Not only does it require coordination among the euro area economies, but the changing political landscape makes a consistent set of policies far more difficult to implement than it does in China. One of the things that may be changing at the margin is in the form of the Ukraine war. The developments that are happening right there are leading to a massive influx of refugees and people who want to look for a different life in Europe. And a lot of these are educated immigrants. They have the ability to bring something to society very immediately. And I think taking a constructive view, as constructive as you can get in these times, for Europe, I think will allow them to mitigate some of the changes that are happening in demography. But their bigger problems are that it is difficult for them to guide people into professions that will allow them to look after the elderly. For example, the demand for nursing activities in Germany has been very low for a very long period of time. The apprenticeship programs over there need to be revamped and reconstructed. And at the same time, the pension reforms that have happened have already forced people into working. So people who wanted to take advantage of a early retirement or very generous pension benefits, we could have thought of them as workers who would be available if things got a little bit tough. So there would be an army of workers who could be brought back into the labor force. We're not seeing that. Over the last 3 decades or so, slowly as changes have come by, and especially in the last decade, more and more workers have started to rejoin the workforce or work for longer. What we've seen now accelerates that trend to some extent. We just don't know how permanent it is. In the US and the UK and in Europe, what we've seen is a lot of people have preferred to take on retirement or to leave fields in which they have an established career and seek something else. Most people call it the great retirement, but I think that's the one new development that's adding to the old problems.
Right. And Professor Liang, do you agree with this? Do you think Chinese people are retiring earlier than they should have? Is it a waste of human capital?
Yeah, China to extend the mandatory retirement age. A lot of the professional older workers, officially, I mean, by the law, they can retire like at the age of 55. For women, it's even earlier. But that's just the legal age they can receive, pension benefit. Usually at 55 or 50, they will be rehired by the company or the government or some social organizations, and they can continue to work and receive salary. At the same time, they're receiving pension. So that's kind of, very generous. So when China having more and more of those elderly, and as China demographics starts getting older, China certainly cannot afford such a early retirement age. China will have to extend or raise the mandatory retirement age in the future. Yeah.
Right, Professor Liang. And as more and more developing countries are starting to feel the pinch of aging population, what do you think about the challenges, especially facing the middle-income countries, that they have insufficient income to take care of their older people?
Well, I think some of the most severe demographic challenge in terms of old age support are those countries, middle-income countries or developed countries with very low fertility rates, such as the Eastern European countries or Southern European countries. Those countries are with the lowest fertility rate and economically not as strong as other Western or Northern European countries. So they are going to be facing the most severe demographic problem. At the same time, they're also suffering from brain drain. They are suffering from young people immigrating out of it. So they're losing more young people, and they're not having enough, producing their own young people, and they are aging rapidly, and economically they are not as strong. So those are the countries, I think, having the most severe demographic problems.
And then, Professor Pradhan, what do you think about the challenges facing middle-income countries? How should they get prepared for the increasing burden on their fiscal strengths to prepare for the increasing fiscal spending on this?
I think it's a matter of something that is inherent to middle-income countries, right? First of all, one of the reasons that many countries are middle-income countries is because they have not yet faced a demographic dividend. If you look in Latin America, if you look in Asia, particularly South Asia, and as you mentioned, Africa, a lot of countries haven't yet hit the level of growth that they need to in order to get per capita GDP high to the extent that it becomes an economy that can look after itself. But barring those, if you look at the economies, I think more pertinent to your question, which is a set of middle-income economies that do have an aging population, that do have economic challenges, I think the one thing that works in their favor, and I think as it does in China and Asia's favor, is that there are inefficiencies in the system. The systems are not efficient. If you look at the advanced economies, the reason they're called advanced is that most of their the restrictions on productivity have already been eased in the past. But that means their ability to grow faster from here is limited. If you're already running at an efficient system and you're still growing at 1.5%, your ability to go to 4 or 5% is almost virtually non-existent. What the middle-income countries have is an ability to open up places where productivity has been trapped, to open up sectors to competition, or to release education and educated workers into the system. That's right. What gives them the ability to grow. So where you have an administration that looks for these kind of positive changes, you need to be positive. So effectively, your question boils down to who's got a problem on a demographic front and whose administrations don't look like they're getting ready for the future. The combination of those two, I think, is the absolute worst case scenario that many middle-income countries will face. And there are some.
Indeed. And let's talk more about technology and innovation, because despite declining workforce population around the world, the global economy has grown due to the advances in technology. Professor Liang, you've been very successful in the tech space, having founded one of China's biggest internet giants in early 20s. Do you think technology advancement and innovation can offset the downside risks of low fertility and aging population?
Well, I always think that fertility problem is more innovation issue, more than a labor supply issue, as you mentioned, that more and more tasks will be automated by the recent advanced technologies, robots and AI, and we'll continue to see productivity gain. And the countries like China, even with the aging population, will have enough resources to support the old, given the technology advancement. It's really how rich an economy or how competitive the economy it will depend on your innovation capability, which will be affected by the size of your talent pool and the age structure of your talent pool. For details, you can look into my recent book on the innovation demographics. So the biggest effect on Chinese economy is the relative strength of its its technology capability or the innovation capability compared to other major advanced economies such as the U.S. The general or the underlying assumption is, of course, the AI can do a lot of things that currently that require human to do, but AI and the robots cannot replace innovators. Cannot do the job of innovation. That's my point, my view. There are people who think AI can do everything. Human can just not do anything, and the AI can take over the world. And that's a different issue. Whether AI can take the world or whether human will let AI take over the world. I don't think human will let AI take over or let AI do the job of innovation. That's just too dangerous. Even AI can do it. I don't think AI can do it. But even AI can do it, human probably will not let them. So I think the jobs of innovation will continue to be in the hands of the smartest people. Now, whichever countries in the world can have the biggest pool of talent, have the best innovators, will win the innovation race that become the richest economy. And whether China can be a technology superpower is mainly determined by its demographics. That's my view.
So, in your opinion, a talent pool is very important for the long-term effects on economy. So, education must play a very important role, right? Education of the Chinese talent pool, yeah. So, Professor Pradhan, what do you think about the increasing demand for education? Could it compensate the loss of working force population?
Yes, of course. To some extent, it does. The question is whether it can bring us back to the standards that we think we were going to receive given past trends, whether we can continue to buy houses at the rate we did, continue to accumulate debt, which will be sustainable, continue to have lifestyles and asset prices that go in the direction that they have over the last 30 or 35 years. That's the question mark. I think one of the things that's happening in China is that the pyramid, the population pyramid that we're used to, is now becoming a barrel. Right? There were younger people in large numbers who have now joined the workforce, and there were a lot of people close to retirement age who will soon be retiring. But what's changing in that population pyramid into becoming a population barrel is that the incoming population is far more educated with much more human capital than the outgoing part of the population. And this is very normal in economies that are growing very quickly, and China certainly fits that bill. I think the issue that we'll have to deal with, and I think Professor Liang was pretty much spot on that basis, is to see, well, how much can you innovate? I would add one more thing to that is when you look at the ability of AI, which as we know is neither artificial nor intelligent, its ability to look after the elderly part of the population is also limited, right?
Right.
Service and education in the United States are considered two of the least productive sectors when it comes to how much human input you need. But the reason you need that input is education and looking after the elderly are both very idiosyncratic activities. My son or someone else's son may have very different teaching needs. And that's why you need that human contact. It's a very similar issue in looking after the elderly. There was a recent experiment in Japan where the government had subsidized healthcare companies to introduce robots into looking after the elderly. Now, one of the effects that it had was that it did improve the quality of care, but it did not reduce employment at all. There were gadgets that helped you look after the elderly a little bit better, but the need for human care, the one thing that robots cannot provide, empathy, was something that human beings provided, and I think that will continue to be the case. We will need jobs to be destroyed, let's be clear, because we will need more and more people to look after the elderly to deal with these idiosyncratic factors.
Right, Professor Liang, what's your view on this? What do you think about the particular challenges facing the service sector to cope with the problem of shrinking labor force, because productivity gains through technology upgrade are diminishing in the service sector?
Well, yeah, on the one hand, some economists think that the AI will create a problem of employment. Others would think that the AI is not going to be fast enough to take care of the demographic or the aging problem. I think the overall is a more gradual but steady replacement or a productive increase by AI. Services could certainly slower than manufacturing in adopting AI. Currently, the manufacturing workers is massively improved. The productivity improved by AI and robots. For service, we're talking about driverless car, autonomous driving for about 10 years now. That people think will still be 10 years away. But if it does happen, it will replace, massively increase the productivity, replace millions of tens of millions of workers in China. So you have to quantify how fast is the rate of the replacement. For like waitress, you see it's very difficult for AI to do, but I've seen restaurants in China now starting to use robots to deliver dishes.
Yes.
So, and the waitress or waiter just need to, hand over the dishes at the last moment, as the last step to the table. And the ordering, the paying, is all done by mobile phone. So actually, even the service sector is starting seeing a lot of automation. And the biggest part, as the previous speaker said, that is hard to be replaced is the empathy. Totally agree. The biggest empathy is from your children, and it's nothing like your son or your daughter like taking care, or even it's just a phone call. It's irreplaceable for elderly.
Yes.
So I think the trend is gradual. Some people have quantified it. So they say like in one generation, in 30 years, 50% of the jobs, including those service jobs, will be replaced. But if you do the math, that would be like 3 or 5% a year of the productivity increase. That's actually pretty healthy and pretty not too slow. Too slow, you will have economic stagnation. Not too fast, as create unemployment that people cannot adjust fast enough. So overall, it's actually quite positive. The rate of the AI replacing the workers, the automation is not too fast, not too slow. It's actually quite healthy pace. So actually, I'm optimistic on the AI having fast enough to help us to deal with the aging and the supply shrinking, but not too fast to create employment.
Well, Professor Liang, do you think, is it possible to train robots or AI to have more empathy for the elderly? Because I've heard of innovations to have AI write songs or even poems. Is it possible to you? Because you are also very successful in the tech space. Could you share with us some of the investment in the sector? What innovations are of particular interest to you to alleviate the problem?
Well, AI can certainly do some creative work or help the artist to do some creative work, like help you to compose music, compose paintings, to help with help create a film or create a cartoon. Yeah, certainly. But the value, empathy, and nothing can replace your children. You're calling your, when you're in the, in the hospital. Nothing can replace the children calling you or meeting you in person. So that's, I don't think that's going to be replaced by AI. Yeah.
So you're persuading Chinese people to have more children, right? Because they say irreplaceable.
Yeah.
Well, so Dr. Pradhan, what do you think about the, you talked about the responsibility because there is talking about inequality between generations. There seems to be a reluctance to make changes because it seems, for example, when we're talking about climate change, it also it creates problem of generational inequality. How to motivate changes right now because the problems are in the future.
It's a fair point you make. No one's willing to pay a price today for some possible benefit into the future, and that's always been a problem. I think a few things are changing at the margin. I think the climate change story has certainly caught on. The number of natural disasters we've had over the last few years are telling us that the problem is at hand. And I think if you look at the largest fund managers in the world, the overall trend seems to be that the only part of the asset management industry that is receiving any inflows is the one that is looking after sustainable investment. We don't have the right standards yet. Those will come. But if you look at the European Union, the regulatory push for green investment is certainly in place. So you do need momentum to build in a particular issue before it can become publicly momentous. The fact that I think China is looking at the population debate so widely and so intensively suggests to me at least that it is one of the places in which that demographic story is beginning to really climb up the priority ladder. I think it's happening in Scandinavia. It's certainly happening in Germany, and I'm really glad to see it's happening in China. Once you get that, one of the earlier comments in your segment was that there are resources that need to be diverted. I couldn't agree more that looking at physical infrastructure is a way of thinking about looking after the population of the past. It's a fixed cost. The incremental benefits of having physical infrastructure are declining every day that the population shrinks. If you look at the Italian economy, for example, there are towns and towns and towns outside on the countryside which are just not populated at all, let alone sparsely populated, which means that there is a change in financing that is required. But that change in financing comes with its own cost. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, the increase in the debt to GDP that is projected for the US economy, where demography isn't changing that aggressively, the debt to GDP is going to rise by nearly 40 to 50% of GDP over the next 2 or 3 decades. That means whatever increase in debt we have had in the pandemic that people are already panicking over is a drop in the ocean. So even though we are changing that story, I don't think it's going to be as easy. The question of how to finance that change, whether the funding is going to the right places, all of these are still significant issues. They would have been easy if interest rates had remained low. But I think the fact that interest rates are going to rise because inflation becomes a little bit more of a problem than we've had in the past makes financing difficult, makes innovation difficult. And I think the overall scenario for the next 30 years is a little bit more challenged for the global economy. I don't think any place is really immune to that.
Indeed. And Professor Liang, you talked about the importance of talent pool, and actually you once said a young, dynamic population with an openness to seeking the best talent from overseas, which comes down to immigration is essential to winning the tech race. How do you evaluate China's migration policy and its impact on population and its innovation capacity?
Well, immigration and attracting talents from abroad is a major factor for all the major countries, including U.S., except China. China, because it's a large population, so you need a massive amount of immigration to really offset the declining fertility rate, which is almost impossible. And China traditionally is not an immigration country, so it doesn't have the culture or the public acceptance to attract a lot of talents overseas. So I think it's a big, very important strategy for innovation and human resource for all other countries except China.
Right, and Dr. Pradhan, what are your thoughts on this? Because we know that migration is projected to be the only driver of population growth in developed regions starting from 2020. How will migration affect developed countries and developing countries, respectively? Well,
mathematically and economically, it is the solution to solve your demographic problem. I mean, if you could have a benevolent dictator, as they used to talk about in our old textbooks, what they could design is simply a reallocation of capital. I mean, Africa has a burgeoning population, and it's very difficult to land them jobs. You will have no doubt followed the Arab Spring, in which one of the biggest problems was that the young people didn't really have jobs. So you have places on the planet where populations are in surplus and economic growth is a little harder to come through because of institutional reform being stuck in the past. You could reallocate these people into the advanced economies, and then you would have a smaller problem on your hands. Politically speaking, that's hard to do. if you look at the French elections right now, the story is between President Macron and Marine Le Pen. And one of the main planks of disagreement have generally been on immigration. That has been tamped down because overall immigration has come down. If you look in the United States, one of the things going against President Biden right now is that illegal immigration has picked up again during his regime. So these are issues that I think economically speaking make sense. You want to have talented people, young people join your economy, give them access to what your country can offer and push forward that agenda. But I don't think politically speaking, it's very easy to do in these economies at all. I think Ukraine is a very unique situation because it has the empathy of the West very strongly behind it. And I think they're being welcomed with open arms over there. But broadly speaking, not all immigration is an open issue in the advanced economies. I think in China, at least from the perception of someone who is on the outside, the broad story seems to be that indeed, it is very difficult to have an open system for immigration, socially speaking or politically speaking. And if you look, China's FDI continues to do well, but it is the surge. It's the rate of growth of places like the Pearl River Delta, which brought in institutions that then created joint ventures with Chinese firms, where the initial moves up in technology was so rapid. Now, China is obviously at the forefront of some technologies in many different areas, electrical grids, new energy vehicles. A lot of the automation that's happening has been innovated through China as well. But the new tech that has to come, I think if you can't have an open immigration system into China, your best bet is to create joint ventures globally. And look, we're talking across borders right here, right now. The chances of collaborating with people outside your country has never been better. You've got a shot, but it's how aggressively it is pursued and how effectively it's pursued that matters.
Right, they're both opportunities and challenges. Well, we have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for your insights. James Liang, research professor at Peking University, and Manoj Pradhan, founder of Talking Heads Macro. So the demographic changes bring a series of challenges to the economy, but the aging society can still be a prosperous society. Confronting these challenges will test our ability to adapt and to innovate. And that's all for this edition of Taking the Pulse of Chinese Economy. I'm Guanxin in Beijing. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.